When reading the Hunger Games trilogy, though all three books begin with a tone of anxiety and fearful anticipation, the first two seem like child's play compared to the third. The final book literally begins with Katniss standing in the ruins, the ashes of what was once District 12. Without a doubt, stepping back into the world of these books is a chaotic experience each time, but Mockingjay is just a bit more depressing than the rest. In fact, the entirety of the final book seems almost out of place compared to the first two. And the audience for this series seems so divided about it as well, black and white. Either they love Mockingjay or they hate it, sadly with far more in the latter category. But why? Is Mockingjay really a bad book? Hey y'all, I'm the Geek Apprentice and welcome back to the 5th annual Hunger Games month here on the channel. In my family, the avid readers are my mom and nearest older brother, both of whom did not like the final installment in the Hunger Games trilogy. Yet, when I finally read the series, knowing how they felt and usually agreeing with them on many things, I did not share their sentiments. However, since talking to many others about this series, I found that many do actually agree with them and that I'm in the minority. Is it just preference, or is there something in their thoughts that leans more on the side of objectivity? Like perhaps Mockingjay just isn't as good of a book as the other two. In today's video, I'm gonna share my thoughts on all of this. How do I feel about this book compared to the other two? Why do I think so many dislike it? Do I think their views are misguided? And finally, why I personally advocate for Mockingjay being an excellent book and the perfect ending to the series. I've said it a million times, Catching Fire is my favorite of both the films and the books. Hands down, it's the perfect middle book. You're not having to drudge through learning the world nearly as much. It's the height of all the action, character development, and story progression. But you also don't have to deal with the fallout of the story ending. You get to the end of the book knowing there's more. But what about comparing Mockingjay to the first book? Well, I kind of love them equally, leaning slightly towards Mockingjay actually. I hope that's not influenced by the fact that I find the first film to be the least desirable of the adaptations, but there might be a hint of that there. However, I do think it has to do with the finality of the final book, seeing resolution, an epilogue showing that the characters, what characters we have left, do actually get a brighter future, even if not for themselves, for future generations. I'll talk about that more later, but it's beautiful. So why do I think so many readers were turned off by this book? Well, as previously mentioned, there was a serious tone shift from the get-go. Yes, they all begin with Katniss being anxious about something, anxious about the reaping, anxious about the victory tour. But in Mockingjay, her entire world has been flipped upside down. Katniss is not in a good mental state. She's constantly having panic attacks requiring her to use grounding techniques, hiding in closets, and just in general, away from everyone. She's a complete mental case. And seeing as the books are entirely from her perspective, her inner thoughts, reading from the brain of someone in that condition, yeah, that would be a little bit challenging. The first two books also follow the same timeline. Katniss is worried about an event. In the first book, it's the reaping. In the second book, it's the victory tour, then the Court of Quell. Something happens just before that event that throws her off. Prim's name being called in the first book, and in the second book, having Snow visit her house, then the announcement that she's gonna have to go back into the arena. The event turns out to be worse than she already thought it was gonna be. Then she goes into the games, but never really leaves them. But what of Mockingjay? The direction is totally different, it would seem. Yes, Finnick Odair makes the remark that this is essentially the 76th Hunger Games, and it's indeed arguable that the whole final book is another game, philosophically speaking. But even so, that's not what the reader is used to, and our intake of the book heavily reflects what Katniss is experiencing in her world. No familiarity. The first two books also have a lot of action throughout, a lot of build-up. And while Mockingjay does have those elements, again, mentally compromised as Katniss is, desolate as 13 is, so few characters as we have, not much happens until Peeta and the other victors are rescued, and even then, there are still not a ton of fast-paced moments. So a reader could potentially feel like things have slowed down too much, wishing there was more physical action instead of just the mental and philosophical action we get throughout. Which, yes, the latter was certainly present in the previous books, but Mockingjay relies on it far more heavily than its predecessors. And many, I guess, really didn't like that and would have rather they had been reading from someone else's perspective so they could get all of the action. And finally, I do think the actual events that transpired upset many. A lot of deaths they believed were not necessary. Choices made by main characters that they disagree with based on their perspective of that character and the story's progression. So are these views misguided or valid? Well, the simple and most obvious answer is that it depends. Jumping ahead of myself, but if someone were to hear my reasoning for why Mockingjay is a good book and responded with, you know, I hear you, I think I see why Suzanne Collins wrote it the way she did, I just don't like it and wish we had gotten something else, then no, they're not misguided. It's just their opinion, and those tend to differ from person to person. But if instead someone responded with, no, that's not how the story should have ended, Suzanne Collins just got lazy, then yeah, that would be a little misguided and presumptuous. I mean, of course you're allowed to not like it, but it is kind of arrogant to assume the author just didn't try because you didn't get the book you wanted. Give me actual direction and real feedback, and then we can banter, knowing that it'll still probably come down to our opinions. In the end, I really think it's just personal taste, opinions, and perspective, of which mine feel very different. Advocating for Mockingjay is a good book, why do I feel that it is a great and frankly underrated read in the trilogy? Let's go back to that tone shift. Whether you like it or not, reading from Katniss's perspective, it makes sense. Her home of District 12 has been obliterated, along with thousands of civilians, many of whom she did actually know. Peeta, whom she loves, whether she'll admit it or not, is being tortured in the capital. She's living in this underground, both physically and metaphorically, cell of District 13. She's now been through the Hunger Games twice, and she's only 17 years old. As if she didn't already have PTSD in Catching Fire, now she probably has what is called CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Now might be a good time for me to note that while I find psychology fascinating and have certainly studied it on my own for fun, I'm not an expert, and these are just my thoughts based on what I have learned and also my own personal experiences. Also, judging by the way she speaks in the book, the way she speaks her inner thoughts, she has got to be heavily depressed on a clinical level, unmotivated, isolating herself, and even things she enjoys don't always stir her that much. I know not everyone is the same, but there are several aspects about how she thinks and acts in this book in particular that I heavily resonate with from my own experience of depressive episodes. Now, I am in no way denying that reading from the perspective of someone this broken and disheveled is kind of difficult. Trying to root for something through the view of someone who is so unmotivated and borderline empty and dead, someone who's basically given up, it would seem. Yeah, that's not the most fun thing, but it is honest and real. When you understand why she's like this, when you understand that this had to be the end result of what she's gone through, when you realize that she won't be like this forever, you sympathize, you empathize. For me, I went from rooting for the downfall of the Capitol to just rooting for Katniss to push through and get some help. She does eventually, painstakingly so, and it's the boost we the reader need to get back to the task at hand. But at the same time, these are all from her perspective. So she's the one we're supposed to be concerned about anyway. Sure, maybe it would have benefited the reader to get more action by reading from someone else's perspective, but that's not what these books are about, not entirely. These books are about her journey, and yes, how one person can make a huge difference, ignite a spark, but Suzanne Collins wrote it from Katniss's perspective for a good reason. Would it have been cool to get more lore, more of what was going on outside of Katniss's world? Maybe. But I care more about Katniss and her journey, and I think that's the point. Besides, we get some of that in the movies, which were overseen partly by Suzanne Collins, so I'm satiated. It is a difficult read, but you cannot deny that it makes 100% clear sense why she's behaving and thinking the way she is. Maybe you would have reacted differently, but you are not the main character. And I would go so far as to say that if you still think Katniss was weak and should have just sucked it up, then you need some serious lessons in sympathy and psychology and a new perspective on what can be defined as strong. Katniss is strong. She's also just a girl who has gone through severe traumas and still manages to push through to the end. If we weren't reading this from inside her head, we would be tempted to think that once she starts fighting again, oh yeah, she's totally fine, completely healed, maybe some residual, but not much there. But that's the beauty of reading it this way. She is striving even though she is still heavily suffering and pushing through on every last ounce of what little hope she has left. What a beautiful look into the mind of someone who pushes through with their daily life despite PTSD or severe depression. And I don't use those terms lightly. They get thrown around today, which greatly annoys me. But Katniss is experiencing them on a level none of us can fully relate to. But for anyone who does suffer from issues such as these, you know what it's like. You know that what you're presenting on the outside can be a far cry from what you're thinking and feeling, if you're feeling at all, on the inside. And that makes Katniss 10 times more relatable. Next, I mentioned the timelines being so different, and honestly, this just comes down to preference. The first two involved a clear Hunger Games, Mockingjay did not. That alone contributed to the tone shift in a huge way. And while I love the idea of the entirety of Mockingjay being a metaphorical, philosophical Hunger Games, as stated before, I understand that it's just not entirely the same as a real Hunger Games. Personally though, I do see how our author tried to ease us into this. Yes, the first two books had a real Hunger Games, but Catching Fire, our second book, did introduce us to the idea of a mental Hunger Games. We see it in how Katniss tries to win over President Snow, then gives up on this and tries to outdo him. Both the second and third books follow the concept moves and counter moves. I respect this idea greatly and thought it made for a great transition from book 2 to 3 while still allowing some shocks to the system. It wasn't entirely different, but different enough to allow us to feel as uneasy as our protagonist. Now, what about the lack of action, or at least less action? I will admit that yes, the first half of Mockingjay is a bit lacking in this department, on a grander scale anyway, and it could make the read feel a little bit slow. And the latter half could seem like it's moving too fast. I don't mind these things, however. The lack of action goes back to my first point about Katniss' state of mind. It's not that nothing is happening, a lot is happening, but Katniss isn't participating in it, so therefore the reader doesn't feel like they're participating in it. And I've already exhausted why I believe this is justified, so I'll move forward. What action there is, though, to me, is incredible and heart-wrenching. And does the latter half move too fast? My answer is no. Not until the end after Prim dies, and even more so after she shoots Coin. But here's the thing. What's left to talk about in the mind of Katniss? She is absolutely emptied by this point. I've discussed this at length in other videos, but Katniss' whole goal was to save Prim. And now that that's gone, how do you expect her to feel? But to me, therein lies the beauty of the end book. Yes, it does move a little bit fast due to the lack of details, but those details everyone wants to know about, they don't apply to Katniss. We learn what's important in her world. She goes home. We learn where everyone else seems to go. Basic information about what the state of the country is. She is so distraught and broken at this point. She's done her part. She's finished. Peeta comes home and is okay. They move forward as best they can. Isn't that what we wanted? Didn't we want this world to be free of the capital regime? Didn't we want to see Katniss free? Though I guess it could be argued that she'll never mentally be free, but you understand what I'm saying. Yeah, we wanted everyone to be happy, but that is not a realistic ending to a rebellion and full-scale war. We even get to see Peeta's kid happy and free, just as Katniss wished for during the games of Catching Fire. It's like I said in the last video, we needed to see that Katniss could move on. That's her true strength. She couldn't save her sister, her goal that started this fire, but she was able to at least accomplish something amazing for the greater part of society, of her country, because of her at least saving her sister from the 74th Hunger Games. But it doesn't end there. We needed to see if Katniss could push forward for future generations, and she does. She and Peeta both begin a new life. And the fact that Katniss does come around and sees that she can have children who will be safe because of the fire she started to put out the crazy of the capital. I'm kind of stumbling over my words here, and I recognize that a lot of this video might be a little bit rambly, but I cannot emphasize enough how beautiful and heartwarming this is. I get it goes fast, but I will be a broken record and say it for the millionth time. These are from her perspective. The way it was written makes sense and is satisfying on the simplest level. The Capitol and the government, that was the bigger picture and giant background story, yes. But these were always about her and her part in that greater picture. This will shock many, but I have zero desire to read this story from another character's perspective. I don't need to. I know what happens on a base level. My interest was, yes, that greater picture, but my main interest was Katniss, the protagonist. So it's incredibly beautiful and satisfying to see the books end with just her in a small way, striving for a life of normalcy. As for my last point about who died and whether people liked it or not, that's also just opinion. Of course the deaths were heartbreaking, but this is war. Important people, or at the very least, important people to Katniss, will die. I've talked ad nauseum about the poetic nature of Prim's death, as tragic as it was. As for other events, such as Katniss choosing to live her life with Peeta, people just need to get over that. Katniss is so clear in the books. Even when she thinks she's choosing Gale, after her first games, there was no going back. She wasn't the same, and as such, couldn't meld with Gale in the same way anymore. And frankly, Gale changed too. She wanted their old life, but even then, even if she'd never gone into the game, she was clear from the get-go she'd never marry or have kids. I know she's a teenager, so I suppose that can be taken with a grain of salt, but still. Do I think Gale would have gone for someone else? I don't know. I can only speak for Katniss's mind, because that's what we read. Peeta, Katniss says it herself, is whom she needs. His gentle strength, his calm to her fire, the dandelion in the spring. I hate that she has to associate Gale with Prim's death, but I get why. No matter how much she wanted to be friends still, their worlds were forever changed long ago, and Peeta is the answer to her needs. He's not perfect, they fight too, but just give these books an honest read, and even if you personally like Gale more, he's not for Katniss. The moment she volunteered for Prim, that was the nail in the coffin. She always needed the dandelion in the spring. The games just pushed it further. Silver lining, I guess. So those were my thoughts concerning Mockingjay and why I think it's a fantastic book and an underrated read. I swear, it does take a lot of effort to read at times, though I love it. But coming off the heels of Catching Fire, which is already a mind-bending and mentally taxing book, and with this being my 12th read-through, so I know exactly what I'm stepping out of and stepping into with the final book, I have to actually mentally prepare myself to read Mockingjay. Like, I have to take this huge sigh after Catching Fire that says, alright, I just got done being completely wrecked. Time to enter a world where my literal soul shatters. My heart is never ready enough, and I love it. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Let me know in the comment section below which of these books, including the prequel, is your personal favorite and why. If you enjoyed the video, consider giving it a thumbs up and joining the Geekdom by subscribing as we try to make our way to 10,000. Fun things in store for when that happens. Also, see if you can catch a stream. I'm usually live on Thursdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time and Fridays at 1:30 Eastern Standard Time. Thank you, of course, to all who support me on the channel, whether as a channel member or as a patron over on Patreon, like Joking Batman, Lorulian Sheep, Geek Mom, and McToppler. Speaking of Patreon, I am making updates to my Patreon with some really cool new perks, so be on the lookout for that video. Also, tons of new merch. Like, I used to have like a decent amount, now I have a ton. Link in the description below. Just remember that everything comes in multiple colors, not just pink. I just love pink, so I display pink, but there's multiple colors of everything. But anyway, that's all for today. Happy Hunger Games month, and may the odds be ever in your favor.